Hello, and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. We have a very special episode for you today, so stick around. Hello, and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. Today we have with us Pack Films writer-director Jim Jenner. He was born in Seattle and began writing professionally at the age of 18 for South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. He joined the Bureau of CBS News there in 1970 and worked throughout Asia and the USA until he returned to his native Northwest and founded his own television production company in 1976. He eventually sold the 60-employee film in 1993. Jim then concentrated on producing independent films, including an award-winning series on Route 66 and documentaries and instructional works on pigeons. He is recognized globally as an articulate advocate that domestic pigeon keeping has a positive effect on individuals, especially children. He also continues to create films for corporations and associations, and recently completed a documentary film for PBS, Saving the Berg, which chronicles the rebirth of his hometown in Phillipsburg, Montana. Thanks for coming on and talking with us today, Jim.
You bet, Philip. Glad to be here.
You have a lot of different movies about pigeons, and that's why we were bringing you on here today. First question I got, what sparked your interest in pigeons as a documentary subject?
Well, they'd always been part of my life. I stumbled into when I was a little boy. We moved into the city, and I got hooked up with a bunch of kids that were catching street birds, bigger, older, tougher than me, and good guys. And that it made me very fond of the birds. And then over time, as you heard from my bio, I ended up with a film production company. So I decided I really wanted to do the one thing that I wanted to do a story about the homing pigeons and the history and how they had been important in war and how magical they were as a racer. And that was I took that childhood interest and the fact that I had a production company and got going on. And there was some wonderful accidents in it too. But I did that in '88 and '89, and then I think it came out in 1990.
So I guess that kind of answers then your background with pigeons there.
Yeah, I think the one thing I have in my generation, and I'm 74, when I was a young man, we were allowed to wander and we were allowed to go explore and ride our bikes and come back, only when our mothers yelled when it was dark. It's a different era now. I mean, children are not allowed to do any of those kinds of things. And I was 10, 11 years old on Skid Row in downtown Seattle, trying to catch pigeons right next to guys who were passed out from drinking too much wine. So, I mean, it was a really interesting kind of a childhood people they don't understand. And then what happened with many of us is we went to the one thing there wasn't any Google, there wasn't anything else. You went to this huge brick building and had to go in and ask usually a lady, as to, where are the books on pigeons? And that's when you start to realize, you go into the library and now here there was these stories about these military birds that had carried messages when they were shot up, and racing birds. And it's like the curtain goes up on a fascinating world compared to the poor little things you're catching on the street.
So how many films have you made to date?
Oh, Philip, I'm sorry. I think it's pigeons. I think it's 12 or 13 maybe. I've been in the production business, long enough to forget most of the things I've done.
So do you have a favorite of the films that you've made? Have any of those stick out to you?
Well, I don't know. You've got kids. Like asking which is your favorite. The one that it always the classic line, "You never forget your first." I mean, it's the wonderful thing about my decision to make a film in '88 was I had built a production company that was a good sized production company. We were doing lots and lots of television advertising and corporate work and everything. And it was a big enough company that I had some free time and I had some money. And so I decided to do like my instead of a novel, writing a novel, I wanted to do a documentary, and I called it Marathon in the Sky. And so I started working on it, and I built a loft. I found birds. I joined it. I knew pigeon guys around me. I built a loft specifically to be able to do some uh, video of the lifestyle of the birds, egg laying, rearing, and all that. And one time I had a chance. I had a good sized business, and we were at an auction, a big charity auction, and somebody said, "Well, here the Weyerhaeuser Company has this wonderful Bell Jet Ranger helicopter, and they're going to take you on a tour of all of their tree farms. Who wants to bid on this tour?" And it's a 4 hour tour, and a Bell Jet Ranger at that time would go for probably $1,800 to $2,000 an hour. So I got it. I got 4 hours with this Belgian Ranger for about $1,000, I think. And then I had to call the pilot and say, "No, I don't want to go to the any tree farms. I'd like to follow some pigeons from one small airport to another airport." And the guy, his name was Jess Hagerman, and he was the Weyerhaeuser corporate pilot. You can imagine what a good pilot he was. And he and a friend of mine who was a marvelous aerial, a great filmmaker, Doug Kahn. We then talked to some friends of mine from Tacoma, Washington, who were training pigeons. They took about 500 birds down to a little airport in Centralia. We knew what they were doing. We were in a helicopter. They let these birds go. And honest to God, I had not had any idea whether the birds would go in 100 different directions or whatever. I had experiences with fixed wing where it was really hard to get birds in flight. We were in the air with some very, very good lenses, and we were realizing, my goodness, these birds don't care about this helicopter. And there's some shots in there, and this is old stuff. It's, the ratio of it's not widescreen or anything, but we had some images where I think one and two birds are filling the frame. And so that's pretty close to birds in flight. And so we ended up with this marvelous stuff with this wonderful helicopter guy who was just, he went out there to chase pigeons around, but he didn't care. And then I showed that film as a preliminary to a bunch of people at the American Racing Pigeon Union. They had a convention, I think it was in maybe in Milwaukee, and I showed it. And a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, you got to show that stuff to Michael Landon." And I thought he had been drinking or so. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "Why?" He said, "No, no, no. He's working on a film about. He's bought the rights to that book where pigeons go to die. He's doing a film down in Kansas, and I think he's been having trouble getting aerial shots." So I kind of wrote it off, and I went home and back to the office. La la la. And no kidding, within a week, I came back from lunch one day, and the receptionist says, "You just got a call from Michael Landon. I mean, the real Michael Landon, Little Joe." And so I called him back, and we basically agreed. He was very interested in what we shot, and I said, "Well, I'm going to be in Los Angeles doing some work on the big pigeon race they have down there." And he said, "Great, come to my office. We'll take a look." And that's what we did. And Doug Kahn, who's actually helped me with the film, he was there too. And here I'm sitting with Michael Landon, and he and his producer are looking, and they're saying, "Yeah, yeah, we can use that." And, "Oh, great, we'll use that. Oh, that's a nice shot. Yeah, we'll use that." And he's talking about an NBC movie of the week that he's working on. He doesn't have footage that he thinks is going to work. I think he said, "Well, we'll pay you a top market rate," which I think was about $75 a second at the time. And I had the foresight to say, "Well, I don't want to sell it. Why don't you just narrate my documentary, and we'll call it good?"
Nice.
And that's what happened. And really tragically, I was going to work with him. I was going to sit down with him and go in the audio studio. He got sick and he wasn't well. And then he called back and he said, "I can't come. Can we patch this? You sit in the studio up there. I'll sit down here." And he did an absolutely brilliant job reading, basically asking me what the scenes were rather than being able to look at the footage. And then I think within 14 months, he'd passed away. He had pancreatic cancer at the time he narrated that film. And so it was the last documentary he ever narrated. But it was the most wonderful kind of, here's this major star, and he did a beautiful job on it. He was very sensitive to what was going on. So Marathon in the Sky, in terms of all the serendipitous things that have happened to me in the pigeon world, has to be number one, just for the fact that it was nobody in the pigeon world really knew me, not in the racing world. And so all of a sudden, here comes this 1 hour movie narrated by one of the top guys on television. And the pigeon world, I became a rock star. I mean, overnight, and it was, um, and I got involved a lot with some of the pigeon efforts, the Pigeon Museum and other things. But that will always be a pretty special film because a number of the people that I asked to be part of it, particularly in England, I asked people that they didn't know me, and I had a fellow named Frank Tasker, one of the best pigeon men I've ever known in my life, took a shine to me and got doors to open that, in most cases wouldn't open. So we are able to do kind of an inside story that was it was not only had some of the best people in the world in the story, in the history of it, but it also had this wonderful aerial footage that was at the time was unprecedented. People hadn't seen it before. And so that's always one of the kind of a benchmark of how it was just a really, really odd situation where I had the equipment, I had the time, I had the resources. And then from my childhood, I had the passion. I wanted to, it was a story that I wanted to tell because anybody who loves pigeons has got a chip on their shoulder from all the baloney we've had to take
Oh yeah.
about, what they do. People have completely gotten away from the fact that, why are pigeons in so much great art? Why do people like the Queen of England and Picasso and all these people have loved pigeons? It wasn't
Mhm.
because they were worried about, a little pigeon poop on their shoe. And and I've tried to advocate that we need to realize that love is worth protecting,
Yeah.
particularly with kids. It's just I have to say this, Philip, that when I did a film called Young Wings, which I was trying to explain the impact on children,
Hmm.
and I'm talking about kids in a youth prison, kids in different parts of the world. I mean, we shot it in Belgium and England and China and a bunch of places like that. When you are able to point out to people that folks that have been involved with pigeons, particularly as children, in almost all cases have turned out okay. And that film, Young Wings, has the last episode is I'm the only white guy in the backyards in South Central LA with a bunch of roller guys, all these wonderful young black guys who are all into pigeons. And we're talking, kind of present day. And in the film we shot, one guy said, well, I said, do you go to a lot of these things? Oh, I go to all of them. I go to the car things and I go to this, but the pigeon things I like because there's never any trouble with the pigeon things.
Yeah.
And what he was talking about, and I met guys who literally one child in the family that had been associated with pigeons was the one that was okay, the one that
Yeah.
wasn't doing a hard time. So that's the passion is when you get something that affects you as a little kid, you don't, and I don't know if you've had that experience. I know you're giving that experience to your own children. It's profound. It's so important. I live in a beautiful part of Montana, and the most relaxing thing I can do is go out and catch a beautiful fish and then put it back. I mean, there's certain things you do that connect you to the world, and watching a bird lay eggs and waiting 17 days for them to hatch, and then seeing whether this pair that you put together produce anything that can figure out how to get home in a hurry. That's all magical.
No, that's great too, especially with teachers. I like I said, I encourage teachers to show these documentaries, especially yeah, the Young Wings, Share the Blue Sky, Oldest Feather Friend, just the really kind of icebreakers and eye openers of why do they have such a bad rap when you hear about this history? It's always shocking to people.
Oh yeah, and the bad rap. I mean, it as much as I've always laughed at his stuff, I would love to. Woody Allen did more harm with one joke with calling rats with wings than any single person I know of. And then the other thing that's happened is people make a fortune exterminating pigeons. Oh, excuse
Yeah.
me. No, they can't exterminate them because this species is so effective and so good at staying alive that they keep coming back. So that it's for exterminators, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So those are the guys that are out there. There was a guy on a show called Dirty Jobs.
Yeah.
You know, may he burn in hell. I mean, the show he did was ridiculous about the disease. He interviews some exterminator saying, "Oh yeah, there's 30 diseases you can get from pigeons. That's why we got to get rid of these things." They're talking about an animal that arguably has been domesticated longer than dogs.
Right.
There is evidence in the caves along the Mediterranean that people were living with and domesticating, not just eating, that they had them as pets before the wolves came in to be warm and be subservient to us. So it's funny to watch how crazy society is about something as simple as what we all know as the bird of peace. You know,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Literally going from the bird of peace to this. I mean, that's pest control companies. It's a service that they've made money on. They're not going to stop doing it. And they can dump all the bad press. Pigeons don't really have lobbyists. I mean, these kind of movies like this, and, we try to raise awareness whenever we can too. And
well, we need to be practical. I mean, the thing, my favorite thing I saw one time was in Ball, Switzerland. The Swiss are pretty good at figuring things out. They basically have official places where the town's pigeons can nest in the tops of churches. It's a story that's in one of the ones that's Share the Blue Sky. What they've done is they've made it where these birds come in and they nest and then they go take every other egg. So they have enough pigeons in the city that some little old lady that really wants to, throw out some grain can do that in a designated park. There's only so many, but there aren't flocks and flocks of pigeons that haven't had enough to eat and all that. It's interesting how everybody's approach to it. The fact domestic pigeons moved out into society and are able to survive is the same thing that happened with domestic cats. I mean, there's more feral cats out there probably in the world than there are the feral pigeons in a way, and they're a lot more dangerous from a health standpoint. But all these things have happened, and it just comes back to our poor hobby where you can't people. Oh, you can't have those in your backyard. There's all kinds of disease, and people legislate against it. It's terrible, and it's sometimes society's changing. I mean, we in the West are doing it less with we have less connection with nature, but Mexico, parts of Eastern Europe. I mean, pigeon racing is huge, and I can't tell you how big it is in Japan, in China. I mean, I went over there to make a movie in 2002, and I thought I knew something about what was going on in the world of pigeons, and I was
they're the ones who just broke the record, I think, for the highest sold pigeon. Was a year or so ago.
yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Well, they love to do that. They love to do that, and it's a very interesting phenomenon because they're not doing that to sell the birds. You never see, somebody that's a Barcelona winner or whatever. I mean, they half the time they're doing it. It's one millionaire outbid another millionaire, and then the birds go into a loft and everybody forgets they're there. Seriously, they have a very interesting approach, and the way they race and everything. They finally are, they used to during the real communist era, the Mao's time, they would send them 2,000 miles away and see if
Wow.
they ever came home. So you didn't need any clocks or anything. If you'd win a race by a week, what I mean?
So, I mean, you're definitely promoting the hobby and kind of raising awareness about it. So, have you ever encountered any surprising little known facts about pigeons when you were doing your research and filming these documentaries?
Where to begin. I mean, I think people forget how, I mean, you've got something that's got a brain the size of your little fingernail, and we don't allow ourselves to realize how intelligent they really are. I mean, a chicken, comes out of the egg and it practically has a driver's license from the time it's hatched because they're fully formed. They can feed themselves and everything. Pigeons really need another 3 weeks, like our babies do, before they're really ready for prime time. And that's because there's so much development going on after they come out of the egg. One of my favorite stories was when I was doing Oldest Feathered Friend. I went to Boston. I went to Harvard because somebody told me about they had pigeons that they used in the lab there, and they had I told them I was doing a thing about birds in the lab, and I wasn't trying to be an animal rights person or anything else, and I had some cred with the other stuff I'd done, or somebody introduced me. I went in there and I met these guys, and met some of their birds, and they had pigeons and other animals. But the guy told me a story that I thought was the most fascinating of all, was that this young student had bought a lot of these pigeons that were now 7 or 8 years old in their little area there. They all had their own little nice area their pen. He designed this system where they would peck. And if they saw two things, a pair of something that came up maybe a minute later or 2 minutes later that they'd seen before, if they pecked the right colored light, they'd get a grain. I mean, I'm not talking about fed. I mean, like one piece of corn. So they'd a picture of the two little screens, a picture of a pipe and a top hat, picture of a chair and a car, picture of this and this, and then if the pipe and the top hat come up again, bingo bango. They were able to remember 300 different pairings, all of them. And some of them were even better than others. 300 different pairings that they'd seen before, almost instantly to get one grain. That's not the only story. This guy, he's obviously a smart scientist. He built this as a student. He graduates. He ends up going out to California and he becomes a full-blown professor. And he's invited to come back to Harvard to lecture on something. This is maybe 5 years later. He comes back to Harvard and he goes to visit his old friends in the lab and he realizes all of his old equipment is in this storage room and a bunch of his pigeons are still there. So he pulls the stuff out, fires it up again, plugs it in, makes sure it works, goes and gets the birds, puts these birds in he hasn't seen them for years, puts them back in there, and they remembered every single pair they'd remembered before.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. We've talked to some professors who's done different work with them, and their intelligence level, and that's impressive on the memory side of it too.
So it's just one of those that's I could go on and on and on about. I mean, some of my there's so many favorite stories of people and pigeons, and particularly like little kids or some I was amazed as a little boy to start to read. It really helped me. I grew up in a family. My dad worked for a bank. I mean, we weren't really wealthy or anything. But when I got into that world of pigeons and I realized that there was a lot of real basic guys, a lot of blue collar guys that were in it, as well as really wealthy guys. And some of my favorite remembrances are there's one famous guy in the Seattle area. He just won a big race called the Puget Sound Futurity, which would be maybe 1,000 birds, and he might have won $2,000 or something. It was back in the 60s. We're talking real. This is a big deal. And I got on the bus and went to visit this guy, and his daughter and his wife were very, very pleasant to me. I was probably 11 or something. I'd gone all the way in the bus, and it was like almost an hour ride. And then he said, well, "You want to go out and see the pigeons?" So okay, he takes me out one on one out to the pigeon loft. This guy was a taxi driver, and Philip, every probably every third, maybe I'm being generous, maybe fourth or fifth word was an F bomb about this or this or this or this. And I've never been around anybody that had butchered the language quite like that. And I had this experience at the age of 11 of sitting there and thinking, okay, now this guy, look at all these beautiful birds, look at all the awards he's won. And I kind of was able to have that epiphany of, he may not be speaking in language that I think is appropriate, but I need to get to know this person. I need to listen and I need to,
Yeah.
not write him off because there's a lot to offer here. And I will never forget that moment of realizing, boy, my parents would be shocked if they knew I was listening to this. And then I thought, well, what the heck? You want to pick up this F and so or this? Yeah, sure, I do. And I want to find out, what did you feed it before you shipped it, and what were its parents like, and all that. Those experiences that any kid that wants to learn about animals or from somebody who's an expert, that kind of you have to take into consideration that you have to learn, you have to shut up, and you have to really learn to respect the person for not what they say, not necessarily what they wear or anything, but what's in their head. And some of those kinds of memories are so strong with me, as much as meeting all these guys that won big races and the other stuff. The childhood stuff, I think, is probably always the strongest.
So we kind of touched on this. I mean, like, what role do you see your films playing in conservation efforts or changing public perceptions of pigeons? Is it really, is that kind of your focus, is to kind of just wake people up to the big history they have, or are you encouraging specific parts of the hobby?
Well, it's a little hard because the hobbies it changes so much in terms of the racing world is being changed by just people can't have backyard anything anymore. So what you could do in the 50s and 60s is not possible. There's other interests. I guess I did the movie so that people would understand, hey, give these poor creatures, these beautiful creatures, some credit. And Marathon in the Sky was this marvelous story. I mean, the swelling music at the end when these birds are coming home after, and here's your bird that you raised, from an egg, and it's 2 years later, and here it comes, and you just know, looking in the sky based on talking to your buddies around you on the phone, that what you're looking at is a winner coming in that you created, that you helped make it the winner that it is, physically and everything else. That kind of that emotional thing is what I've always tried to have people understand. That's the racing side. At the same time, doing things about shows, and you see guys that have that same look when they've entered a bird, and they've had their bird in there with 12 or 18 other birds, and all of a sudden,
Right.
they are the grand champion. That's the same kind of moment that I think people are always looking for in any kind of a hobby. Obviously, pigeons are not for everybody, but it's so hard to say that anything that I've done over the last 40 years is current today, because situations change. And I do know that there's one thing that will not change, and that is, I have hundreds of times in my life, I have seen a child look at this bird for the first time and watched, particularly when they understand they have to be gentle. We're talking about changing your behavior, because pigeons and horses, anything with its eyes on the side of its head, that's a prey animal. It thinks something's going to kill it every second of the day. So it's all ready to be spooked. And when you, as a child or even an adult, can make that bird, and the same with a horse, when you can make it, when you can be calm enough that you can pick it up, that you can react to it, and it doesn't fly around and they don't all, explode around you because they're so afraid of you, that changes you as a person. That makes you a different person. And I've seen it. That's, I think, one of the reasons why the pigeon guys, like they say, oh yeah, the pigeon guys were always okay. Those brothers doing hard times for murder, but the pigeon guys were okay. That connect, and I'm not kidding. You take Mike Tyson, okay? Now Mike had a rough time after becoming a champion. He was so abused by the people, his advisors and everything else. Mike Tyson's first fight was on the rooftop in Bedford-Stuyvesant, when the neighborhood bully asked to see his favorite pigeon,
Yeah.
and pulled its head off. And Mike Tyson won that fight that day and didn't lose a fight for 20 years. With all the things that have happened in his life, I think he's finally married to a gal that, he deserves, and deserves him or whatever. What's he gone back to? He's got pigeons again. And he came to a pigeon show in LA. Some friends were telling me he told them they'd be there for an hour. And he came back for several days in a row and made friends with everybody and wanted to see everybody's pigeon. And he wasn't the heavyweight champ. He was Mike Tyson, this little pigeon kid from, really the toughest neighborhood in New York. And those stories, when you think about, this little bird having that effect on people, I've always felt good about advocating for that, no matter what. And the things about disease and other stuff, I mean, I personally have an allergy that's very rare, but I can't be around them because of the dander that's on their feathers, and that's unfortunate. But the whole idea that there's so many diseases is just, in this very antiseptic society, it's become a crucible that it's very hard to overcome. And it's very hard to overcome with parents who, the hovercraft parents that don't want the kids to do anything. I've had several instances where the kids were dying to have pigeons, and the moms were like, nope, no, they can't do that.
The lessons that you can teach a kid with pigeons are the same lessons that you can teach a kid if you're living on a farm with cows and sheep, but they're much cheaper. You got to clean water, clean food, stay on schedule with it, take care of it, and it's not going to break the bank. You don't need 20 acres of land. You can do all this in a tiny backyard. You could just do it as a pigeon, as a house pet too.
You also have the accelerated generational thing, that, I mean, that when in a couple of years as a child, my kids or your kids, they see a baby that they saw come out of the egg, and then it becomes a teenager, and then it gets married, and then it has a family right in front of them, and they see two or three generations. And that's why Darwin worked with pigeons, because he could look at three or four or five generations in in
Right. Yeah.
two and a half years. And so to look at, I went to Down House and where he did his experiments, and they've got some stuffed birds there that are. It's one of the films we did, and there's one that looks. The front end looks a little like a roller, and the back end is a half of a fantail, and I think the wings were droop wings, and anyway, so you're looking at one of the ones that Darwin created, right? There was this kind of blend of these different things. And then when they kept putting they put different breeds together, within 3 generations, they all came back and
Yeah.
looked like a rock dove. He could breed them that quickly in his backyard, just like you said. You're not, the pigeon stuff is fun because it is something that's in your backyard. It's at home. It does get you out. I mean, you go to visit other people but the other thing that the most marvelous part of the racing world, and for roller guys too, but for the racing guys is, I mean, you send something a long ways away, and you sit there thinking, okay, all whether this thing's coming back or not, and how fast is all on me. How I treated it, how I bred it, how I raised it, how much fresh air it had, how I trained it. Did I make it want to come here? Did I make it comfortable here? Did I make it love this place so it's going to go faster than those other guys? And when you see something coming out of the sky that if you talk to your buddies on the phone, and everybody's on their cell phone now, but back in the day, it used to be, my mom yelling out the window, well, he said he let it go. That's epic. And that's just, you can't, I don't care what they say. You're not going to get any video game that gives you that real kind of satisfaction of watching that dot become, something that hits the landing board.
That's the moment right there. That's why they do everything. That's why they get up and feed every day and water that. Yeah, when that bird comes back from a race, that's it right there. That's pinnacle.
Yeah, and it is a beautiful thing. It is just like horse racing or just like anything where you get, a lot of people involved in the competitive nature, and you get a lot of money involved, and that's really what's sadly happening with the Chinese market made Europe go nuts. I mean, what made Belgium and all those places just go, holy cow. I'm making millions of dollars selling these things, and nobody even knows I've got the cash. I mean, it was that became the whole idea of how much money birds are worth is in a way is laughable. I don't know, you're not a racing guy, but the secrets of champions, the underlying point of the whole thing over and over and over again is don't believe the BS. Is don't believe somebody that tells you they got the greatest and this and that. It's all these guys who are bona fide, rock hard champions of champions, for generations, telling you, yep, you don't need to do that. You need to do this and this and this, and keep your eye out for this, and this. And that's what I loved about that series, because it was the antithesis of all the big money guys and oh, you got to do this. And I loved that when guys would call me, oh, I'm so and so, so and so. You probably heard about me, and I was hoping, I think you got to do a film about me. And I would enjoy telling them, well, I don't think that's going to make our schedule, because the real guys, the really men and women that are very, very good at this game tend to be rare people with stock sense. And that's something it's the same with people with horses. It's the same with people with they've got just some kind of way of mentally connecting and understanding the creature that they're dealing with. And it's beautiful to watch. I mean, it's not, I wrote a book about it, and I'd love to tell you some other, it's called The Featherhood. And I tried in that book to do two things. One is I tried to explain how certain people in certain parts of the world, like guys I met in Belgium, they could look at 100 pigeons in a loft and tell you, I want that one, and I think that one over there. And they would be able to somehow sense what was going on, unlike anybody I'd ever seen. And they maybe second or third generation. I did this story because it's about guys like that. At the same time, it's about a bunch of inner city kids that find this phenomenally valuable bird that's escaped. It's just one of those stories that I based it on everybody that I've met in doing pigeon stories all over the world. The millionaire guys and the street kids like me. and it all comes to an end as far as a big race, and it's set in Tacoma, Washington. And but one of the things I did that for was that there would be something that for kids, they could read it and really start to understand what's going on in the bird's head. That was the most fun for me, was trying to write about what the bird was thinking without it being anthropomorphic, which means without me making it have human traits. And some of the reviews, my favorite reviews, were from some pigeon, a couple, particularly in England, and they've got some wonderful writers. The guys that they write a lot. Was that I had made it where I did not anthropomorphize, and it helped them to even understand kind of what the birds were thinking. That was fun to try to do that. Every one of these films I've done, it's got its own story, so there's just no way to know where to.
No, yeah, well, let's do that. Let's set up another time and we'll talk about the book The Featherhood. We're up against the clock on this one. So any members of the AU members can watch his films on the AU website, and that's free if they're AU members. Is that right?
Yep, and they have to check with the national office. There's a password. I wish I knew it, but they can check, and then and that's the documentaries, as well as, and frankly, I think a lot of guys that, if particularly if you're new to the sport, if somebody's listening to you is probably looking for any information they can find. The one thing about Secrets of Champions, I will tell you, is that several of the guys have passed away, but they were some of the greatest. And I was the guy that got to decide who was in it. I mean, nobody paid me, nobody, and there's plenty of people out there getting paid to make racing guys famous because the money's there. These were all, a couple of them were guys that I couldn't even believe they'd agreed to be in it. They didn't need it. And it said a marvelous guy in Ireland named Ronnie Williamson, probably the greatest racer in the world, at least when we did this. And couple of English guys, and then a marvelous guy in Holland. And then the series expanded, and we visited Germany and Poland and all kinds of places to show what was going on in the world. But that Secrets of Champions is one of the things that's probably, for an AU member, a really good way of looking about housing and feeding. And there's one film that's on pigeon lofts. I think it's 3 hours long. I mean, you got to really like pigeon lofts to want to watch that one.
You touch on a lot of different aspects of it. There's definitely a lot of good racing stuff. And then pigeonfilms.com is another way that you can watch your films.
Yeah, well, you can buy them, and then you can get them online. In other words, you watch them, you stream them, and they're not, there's nothing that's on the 2024 Barcelona race. I mean, the last one we did, I think, was in 2016. The one about Spring Hill is pretty interesting. That's Secrets of Champions 7. That's got an awful lot of stuff that people might find interesting, because that's some of the best guys in the world that all have gone down to Florida to race against each other.
First off, thanks for all your efforts in promoting the hobby with these films. That's terrific, and I'm sure it's helping a lot of people get in it and getting better at it. And thanks for coming on and talking with us today.
Well, Philip, I'm glad you're doing well, and you're getting so many episodes under your belt. I'm proud to be part of it. So hope we can do it again.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. Please help the pigeon hobby by telling your fellow club members or other pigeon friends about the podcast. And please leave a good review for the podcast wherever you do listen. If there's ever a topic or person you'd like to see on the podcast, please send us an email to allaboutpigeonspodcast@gmail.com, and thank you so much for listening.